So this is a treat. The topic, which is compelling and controversial, probably not in this group, but elsewhere, and sometimes complicated. And I thank Carol Ann Benton for letting us know that Ellen Singer would come speak with us about it. Carol Ann, you're on for your introduction.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, okay. There's quite a lengthy bio, so some of you have probably read it already. And if you get a chance to read it, I'm not going to go into great length because I would prefer to give more time to Dr. Singer. But Dr. Alan Singer is a historian and also involved in social studies. He's a professor at Hofstra University, author of many books, which are listed in that bio. He has expertise in history of slavery. He also has been involved in writing articles for Daily Kos and Huffington Post. And I also discovered that he is involved in Media Watch with Bob Anthony and Eric Tate. And I saw him on Friday in 2020. He made some comments in regards to the Ahmaud Arbery case. So he's involved in quite a bit, which relates to history and social studies, and quite a bit on the history of slavery. I would like to thank you on behalf of Dorry's and all the attendees for your presence here tonight and such a controversial topic like Julie mentioned. And again, I don't want to spend too much more time. Just please read the bio that came with your email. And Dr. Singer, I turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Just before I begin, I'd like to ask, do people have specific questions? They can either just unmute and ask, or they can put the question into the chat. But that way I can make sure that I touch on things that are concerning people. Again, or you can just put it in the chat as we go. You know, that way you don't have to remember it to the end. But just any questions or comments, just please put them in the chat. And Carol Ann, what you can do is if there's something like that needs to be clarified, you could just cut in or signal me somehow so I know. All right, I'm going to turn on the slide share, screen share. And let me play from start. So what we're going to focus on is the origin and meaning of critical race theory. Now, that's my email address at Hofstra, CATAJS. And if you email me, I'll put you on my updates list. Now, on a recent CNN broadcast, host Chris Cuomo interviewed comedian commentator Bill Maher about a supposed left-wing peril threatening the United States, feeding him a series of softball questions and responding with, "Oh my God," facial expressions. Now, after acknowledging I'm not in schools, and I have no interaction with children, Maher announced that he has heard from people all over the country that, quote, kids are sometimes separated into groups, oppressor and oppressed, and being taught racism is the essence of America, end quote. He then derided this practice as just silly, it's just virtue signaling. And then he accused people advocating for curriculum revision of being afraid to acknowledge progress, a psychological disorder he alternately labeled wokeness and progressive phobia. Now, Maher's comments on wokeness and progressive phobia reminded of a 19th century medical condition described by a Dr. Samuel Cartwright from Louisiana in the DeBose Review, 1851, as drapetomania, the disease causing Negroes to run away from slavery. Somehow that was a mental illness, a desire to escape from slavery. I kept waiting for Chris Cuomo to ask Marr to provide an example, any example, to support his claims. But Cuomo never did, and Marr never felt compelled to offer any evidence. On his television show, Marr promotes a group of contrarians that want to start their own college where they will be free to present offensive ideas and dismiss objections without having to provide supporting evidence or answer to anyone. Cuomo never asked Marr about that either. In August 2021, the Brookings Institute reported that at least 8 states had passed legislation banning the teaching of critical race theory, although only Idaho actually used the phrase. The modern iteration of critical race theory began in the 1980s when legal scholars, followed by social scientists and educational researchers, employed CRT as a way of understanding the persistence of race and racism in the United States. Kimberly Crenshaw, who teaches law at UCLA and Columbia and was an early proponent of critical race theory, described it as, quote, an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is past and that laws and systems that grow from that past are detached from it. Basically, critical race theory disputes the idea of colorblindness or legal neutrality and argues that race and racism have always played a major role in the formulation of American laws and practices of American institutions. It is a study of laws and institutions that sifts through the surface cover to look for underlying meaning and motivation. In my work as an historian, I trace the current debate over citizens' arrest back to its implementation in the South during the Civil War, when it was used to prevent enslaved Africans from fleeing bondage. Citizens' arrest essentially empowered any white person to seize and hold any Black person they suspected of a crime. The crime, of course, was stealing white property by stealing themselves. As an academic discipline, CRT does not claim that everything about the United States is racist or that all white people are racist. The CRT lens examines laws and institutions, not people, and certainly not individual people. What has come to be known as critical race theory approach to understanding the United States history and society actually has much deeper roots, long before the 1980s. A 19th century French observer of American society, Alexis de Tocqueville, in the book Democracy in America that was published in 1835, wrote, I do not believe that the white and Black races will ever live in any country upon equal footing. But I believe the difficulties to be still greater in the United States than elsewhere. As long as American democracy remains at the head of affairs, it may be seen that the freer the white population of the United States becomes, the more isolated it will remain. Now, de Tocqueville, his work is often celebrated, but textbooks largely ignore that passage. In an 1852 Independence Day speech delivered in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass rhetorically asked, What to the slave is the 4th of July? Douglas then answered his own question. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence given by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the growth, injustice, and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Our shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. In the 19th century, a reverse CRT lens was openly employed by racists to justify the laws and institutions derided by de Tocqueville and Douglas. In the majority opinion of the Supreme Court in its 1857 decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney claimed, and the court ruled, that, quote, a free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, because when the Constitution was adopted, they were not regarded in any of the states as members of the community which constituted the state, were not numbered amongst its people or citizens. Consequently, the special rights and immunities guaranteed to citizens do not apply to them. That was a Supreme Court decision in 1857. The deep roots of racism were recognized by the United States Congress when it drafted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. Abolitionist and civil rights proponent Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania issued a warning in December 1865, quote, we have turned or about to turn loose 4 million slaves without a hut to shelter them or cent in their pockets. The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or managing the ordinary business of life. This Congress is bound to provide for them until they can take care of themselves. If we do not furnish them with homesteads and hedge them around with protective laws, if we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better left them in bondage. If we fail in this great duty now, when we have the power, we shall deserve and receive the excretion of history and of all future ages. Thaddeus Stevens was right. Enforcement legislation was gutted by the Supreme Court, making way for Jim Crow segregation, Klan terrorism, and the disenfranchisement of Black voters for the next 100 years. The power of racism was so great that in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in the Forethought to the Souls of Black Folk that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The legal system recognizing the legitimacy of racial distinction was affirmed by the Supreme Court in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision. Although the Supreme Court reversed itself with the Brown v. Topeka, Kansas ruling in 1954, legal action to change American society really started with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both designed to finally enforce the 14th Amendment prohibition that states could not make or enforce laws that, quote, abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, as amended in 1982, outlawed laws and practices that had the result of denying a racial or language minority an equal opportunity to participate in the political process, even if the wording of the law did not expressly mention race. A racist result was racism. So what we have is very clearly a critical race theory approach being used by both racists and anti-racists throughout the history of the United States. You know, the racists didn't mind it being used when it supported their control of society. But a critical race theory approach was used in the 64 and Civil Rights Act and in the 65 Voting Rights Act. Now, the New York State Court of Appeals also argued that under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, a law could be challenged as discriminatory if the practice has a sufficient adverse racial impact. In other words, whether it falls significantly more harshly on a minority racial group than on the majority. Proof of discriminatory effect suffices to establish liability under the regulations promulgated pursuant to Title VI. Governments have the obligation to demonstrate that less discriminatory alternatives were not available. This is the origin of critical race theory. If a law has a discriminatory impact, the government must demonstrate that there was no other alternative. This wasn't done by Black Lives Matter. This was done by the United States Congress and the United States Supreme Court. Now, according to the Texas Tribune, the new Texas law designed to limit how race-related subjects are taught in public schools comes with so little guidance. The on-ground application is already tying up educators in semantic knots as they try to follow the legislature's intent. In one Texas school district, a director of curriculum instruction notified teachers that they had to provide students with opposing perspectives on the World War II era European Holocaust, presumably Holocaust denial voices. It remains unclear if science teachers will now have to legitimize social media claims that COVID-19 virus arrived on Earth from outer space. The bit on the Holocaust, I think, is important. As a teacher, I believe it is crucial to provide students with multiple perspectives, alternative views. But the multiple perspective on the Holocaust is not whether the Holocaust happened or not. It happened. It is not whether the Holocaust were good or bad. It was bad. The multiple perspectives on slavery is not whether it happened. It happened. And it's not whether it's good or bad. It was bad. What I argue is that from multiple perspectives on the Holocaust, students have to examine why it happened, not whether it happened. Multiple perspectives on slavery means students have to examine why it happened, not whether it happened. Now, in her blog, Heather Cox Richardson, an American historian and professor of history at Boston College, focused on subjects that were X'd out of the law as specifically permissible to teach. They include the history of Native America, X'd out of the law. So things that you're not supposed to teach include the history of Native Americans, the writings of founding mothers, Thomas Jefferson's discussion on religious freedom, Frederick Douglass's articles in the Northern Star, William Still's records for the Underground Railroad, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, documents related to women's suffrage and equal rights, documents on the African American Civil Rights Movement, including Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and his 1963 I Have a Dream speech. The Texas legislature also X'd out the history of white supremacy, including but not limited to institution of slavery, the eugenics movement, and the Ku Klux Klan, and the ways in which it is morally wrong. Now, what struck me more, though, was what the Texas legislature decided to include, documents they apparently had never read. The good topics include the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Federalist Papers, included specifically 1051, excerpts from de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and the transcript of the first Lincoln-Douglas debate from 1858 when Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas for senator from Illinois. When you read these documents through a critical theory lens or any critical lens, they expose the depth of racism in America's founding institutions. Again, I don't think the Texas legislators read them because they never would have allowed them. The Declaration of Independence includes a passage that has stuck with me since I read it as a high school student in the 1960s. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I was always impressed by the vagueness of the passage. Who has the right to abolish a government? Did they mean the majority of the people, some of the people, or did the decision have to approach near unanimity? Now, they were vague on purpose because they realized they didn't have a majority of the American people supporting them in 1776. So they never spelled out how it would be decided.
Alan, there's a question in the
Okay.
chat. I don't know if you see it.
No, I don't. Could you read it to me?
Okay, one of them says, do they include Thomas Jefferson's notes on the native state of Virginia where he denigrated the race?
Okay. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. That's a good one, all right?
Okay.
Right. Thank you. Now, one of the things I've wondered when I read the passage is if people have a right to alter or abolish government and replace it, well, did enslaved Africans share this right to rebel? Now, we know they didn't, but if you read it, they could. Now, the words slave and slavery do not appear in the United States Constitution until passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 that banned slavery. However, a number of clauses in the original document were intended to protect the institution. The 3/5 compromise, which refers to other persons, gave extra voting strength to slave states in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. In the 1800 election, Thomas Jefferson is elected president over John Adams because the 3/5 compromise gave Southern states extra electoral votes. Another clause forbade Congress from outlawing the transatlantic slave trade for at least 20 years. But the clause recognized and permitted the slave trade to continue. A fugitive slave clause required that freedom seekers who fled slavery to states where it was outlawed had to be returned to slavery if they were apprehended. The Constitution also mandates the federal government to suppress slave insurrections, and the Second Amendment protected the right of slave patrols and slave holders to be armed. Both Federalist Paper 38 and 54, which were mostly written by future President James Madison, himself a slaveholder, expressly justified slavery. Now, the Federalist Papers were written during course of debate over the passage of the Constitution, and they were designed to explain why the Constitution was a good idea. Madison first mentioned slavery in Federalist 38, where he defends the right of the national government to regulate American participation in the transatlantic slave trade. In Federalist 54, Madison explains the legitimacy of the Constitution's 3/5 clause and of slavery itself. Madison explained, in being compelled to labor not for himself but a master, in being venable by one master to another master, and being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal domination of property. In being protected, on the other hand, in his life and his limb, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and being punishment himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of society, not as a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slave when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. They have the mixed character of persons and property. In the first Lincoln-Douglas debate, August 21st, 1858, again, something that you're allowed to teach in Texas, Stephen Douglas accused Lincoln of trying to abolitionize American politics and supporting a radical abolitionist platform. Lincoln responded that he was misrepresented. While Lincoln claimed to hate slavery, He did not want to free them and make them politically and socially our equals. My own feeling will not admit of this, and if mine would, we know that those of the great mass of white people will not. We cannot then make them equals. Anything that argues me this idea of perfect social and political equality with the Negro is but a specious and fantastic arrangement of words. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Lincoln then added in words that show the depths of American racism, I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid them living together upon the footing of perfect equality. This is 1858, and Lincoln is mirroring the words that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in 1835. The real question for me is why the big outrage about critical race theory today? A group of traditional historians were infuriated by claims in the New York Times 1619 Project that race and racism have played a significant role throughout American history, including as a motivation for the War for Independence. Whatever you think about that claim in the 1619 Project, I don't think anyone seriously believes that opposition by a small group of historians is the basis for the assault on critical race theory. The much criticized opening essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones does not even mention critical race theory. I believe the public attack on critical race theory, including in school board meetings, are a right-wing response to challenges to police actions following the murder of George Floyd and to the Black Lives Matter's demand for racial justice. They have nothing to do with what or how we teach. CRT became controversial when President Trump denounced it in an effort to rally his supporters during his re-election campaign. Trump declared without any evidence, what a surprise, that, quote, critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools, it's being imposed into workplace training, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. Now, according to Professor Crenshaw, acknowledging racism was being defined by President Trump and his supporters as racism. Quote, the rhetoric allows for racial equity laws, demands and movements to be framed as aggression and discrimination against white people. So Trump rallies opposition to CRT, claiming it's aggression and discrimination against white people. We don't teach CRT in pre-K to 12 curriculum because we don't teach theory. We certainly don't teach children to hate themselves or this country. What we do teach is critical thinking, and a critical race theory approach is definitely part of critical thinking. In a Colorado school discussion, Stephanie Rose Spalding says, we need to ask why there's still inequality in housing. Why is there still inequality in education? Why is there still inequality in employment rates and healthcare if the law is articulating that racism is no longer a factor? Critical thinking means asking questions about the text and events and evaluating evidence. It is at the core of Common Core in social studies education. I like to cite the conservative faction of the Supreme Court that claims to be textualists, meaning they carefully examine the text of laws to discover their meaning. Because they will need to become active citizens defending and extending democracy in the United States, we want young people to become textualists, to question, to challenge, to weigh different views, to evaluate evidence, and read documents as they formulate their own ideas about America's past, the state of the nation today, and the world they would like to see. Texas anti-CRT law includes more traditional social studies goals, analyze and determine the reliability of information sources, formulate and articulate reasoned positions, understand the manner in which local, state, and federal government works, actively listen, engage in civil discourse, responsibly participate as a citizen in constitutional democracy, effectively engage with government institutions at the local, state, and federal level. There should be an appreciation of the importance of responsibility of participating in civic life, a commitment to the United States in its form of government, and a commitment to free speech and civil discourse. So the same law that outlawed critical race theory calls for these things. Given these very clearly stated civics goals, I recommend that Texas social studies teacher obey the civics legal mandate by organizing with their students a mass campaign to challenge restrictions in the Texas law, including classroom civil disobedience by reading the material X'd out by the law. Maybe someday students can share Martin Luther King's dream. Now, to support teachers, one of the things I do is I develop social studies material, document-based material that helps them to understand the role race and racism has played in American society. So one of the lessons I create, and I'll send this to Julie and to Carol Ann to distribute, is how enlightened was the European Enlightenment? One of the things, we always argue that it's based on reason, it's based on science. Now, while there are no firm dates, most historians agree that European Enlightenment started in the mid-17th century, building on the scientific revolution, continued to the mid-19th century. Some historians have also pointed out that the age of reason in Europe was also the peak years of the transatlantic slave trade, when millions of Africans were transported to the Americas as unfree labor on plantations. So the question then becomes, how enlightened was the European Enlightenment? And in the lesson, students look at a series of documents, including Jefferson's note on the state of Virginia. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, in 1848, American suffragettes, feminists, argued, well, what about the women? Don't they have these inalienable rights? Frederick Douglass wanted to know why Africans didn't have these inalienable rights. Well, partly we know that while Jefferson wrote those ennobling words, he also wrote in the description of enslaved Africans that their griefs are transient. Those numberless afflictions, which render it doubtful whether heaven has given life to us in mercy or in wrath, are less felt and sooner forgotten with them. In general, their existence appears to precipitate more sensation than reflection. It appears to me that in memory they're equal to the whites, in reason much inferior. So what we have in Jefferson's state notes on the state of Virginia, 1785, 9 years after he wrote the Declaration, he makes it very clear that people of African ancestry are no way equal to rights and morality, in reason, or in emotion. And they are not included in the phrase, all men are created equal. So when Justice Tawney in 1857 says the founders did not believe that Africans were citizens and equal, he's only quoting Thomas Jefferson. Another lesson I work on with teachers is called What Did Jefferson Buy in October 1803? And it's an interesting lesson. It can be done in 7th grade is where it's usually picked up, because the claim is that the United States purchased Louisiana, all land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountain Continental Divide. If you go walk up to the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, it's about an hour north of Denver, you actually stand on the Continental Divide. If you empty your canteen to one side, the water flows into the Pacific. If you empty your canteen on the other side, the water flows through the Mississippi system into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. So since they had no idea what land was actually there, France sold the United States its claim to the easternmost watershed, everything flowing from the Continental Divide east. Now, the thing is, there were about 10,000 French living in Louisiana at the time. Half of whom were enslaved Africans. The reality is that the tens of thousands of people living in that area were Native Americans, dozens of tribes who never even heard of the French, who never gave their land to the French. So the United States purchased French claims to lands it did not occupy, to lands it did not own, to lands it did not have a right to claim, to lands that belonged to other people. So what is critical race theory in terms of schools? Critical race theory is just part of the idea that students have to question received truth. And that, my friends, is what social studies is all about. So it's 6:45, and at this point, I'm done. And so I see there were other points in the chat.
I suggest answering the ones in the chat, and then we can help you see whose hands are raised.
Very good. Okay, so the first one is just on the Confederate documents. I thought that was, it's interesting. They don't expressly mention the Confederate documents, but what they do mention is that students should not be taught that whites in American society at the time was expressly racist. Now, Barbara, you raised your hand. Why don't you ask her a question? Barbara Wexler?
Yes. I have two questions. One is a very big one, which I don't know you can answer. There was slavery all over the world, all over the world. Britain had abandoned their slave policy earlier than the United States. But for some reason, it is us that has this quote unquote issue. And I'm curious as to why our country does and no other country seemingly does or doesn't. The other question has to do, because have a history of being a teacher and professor as well. We can teach everything we want to teach. However, I have issues with the people who write the textbooks. And there are big problems created by people who write textbooks and who they sell them to, and textbooks get authorized to be used in specific schools, etc.
All right, let me address it. Actually, it's a very good question. And it's multiple parts. There's an historian, Robin Blackburn, who's a British historian. And Blackburn makes a distinction between societies with slavery and slave societies. And I think it's a very important distinction. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome were slave societies. More than half their residents were enslaved, and they were the primary workforce in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Many societies have some form of bondage, but in those societies, even peasants and serfs in Europe did not lose their status as human beings. And their status, but one thing that's often raised is, well, wasn't there slavery in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa? And the answer for me is that we're using the same word to describe two different circumstances. Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in West Africa, you don't have a prison system. If someone breaks the law, or if someone gets captured in a war, or if someone is impoverished, what do you do with them? Now, in a society with a prison system, you lock them up. Well, what happened in sub-Saharan Africa is people were put into temporary bondage. We call it slavery, but it's not what happens, or chattel slavery in the Americas. In that bondage, you remain human. Your status is not inherited by your children. And when you've done your time, you're no longer subject to the crime and you're no longer in bondage. Essentially, it was a much more humane system than locking people up or just killing them. Now, this what we call slavery or chattel slavery really develops with what we call commercial capitalism starting after the Columbian Exchange in the 16th century. In order for the European nations to clear the Americas, in order for the European nations to profit from commodities like sugar and then later cotton and tobacco, they needed a labor force. And what they did is they arrived at a system of chattel slavery where people lost their status as human beings, where their status was defined by the color of their skin, and it was inherited by their offspring. This was a new system that had never existed in the world before. And this system, a slave society, develops in the America by Europeans who capture and transport 11 million Africans to the Americas. Now, the United States has a particular problem that, for example, the Caribbean does not. The Caribbean are plantation societies, which means they're overwhelmingly Black and enslaved. The United States is a settler colony, which means that maybe 25% of the population were enslaved, but the bulk of the people were white Europeans. To justify enslavement in the United States, they develop a system of racist distinction that continues after the end of slavery. So I argue that because of the capitalist exploitation, the transatlantic slave trade, and the fact that the United States is a settler colony, the racism that justified slavery, and then the racism that existed after the Civil War, slavery by another name, dominates American society. And that's why it's different in the United States. There was another question. Someone asked the difference between critical race theory and critical thinking. And now this is, in my view, now critical thinking is the most important aspect of social studies education in the United States, in every state, by every standard, national standard. And the idea is that students should be able to examine documents and ideas and facts and evaluate them. Whatever information they learn is not as important as the skill of critical thinking, because the information doesn't go with them, but critical thinking is something that they bring with them for the rest of their lives, in their careers and as citizens. Critical race theory, at least in my view, is just a component of critical thinking. It says to students that we have to apply our critical thinking skills to understand the role that race and racism had played in American society. It seems to me that that's quite normal. It doesn't teach kids that they're inferior or that they're oppressors. It teaches kids they have to look at the institutions of the United States with a critical eye, which is what social studies education is about. So Emil asked, why do so many people oppose it? And my answer, again, is the Republican Party has taken a very sharp turn to the right. I don't even call them conservatives anymore. And they have used race as a way of rallying white voters to support the party. Now, they don't just use race. They've been absolute lunatics about mask mandates, about vaccinations. When you asked Ron Paul whether he's vaccinated, he said, well, it's a personal issue. I'm not going to discuss it. Well, we know damn well he's vaccinated. He's not an idiot. It's a personal issue. I'm not discussing it. Well, that's because he's telling other people not to get vaccinated and not to wear masks. So what we're looking at is a political movement that is using the supposed critical race theory in schools as just a way of mobilizing right-wing support and white voter support for Republican candidates. Are there other questions, other thoughts?
I need to tell you that we do have a commitment to stop at 7. And
That's all right, I'm hungry.
I'm wondering whether you would consider coming back soon and give us some time to think about this. We do not have anyone scheduled for either of the next 2 weeks. Well, I guess 2 weeks from now. What's that, the 14th of?
Hold on a second. I got to check my calendar.
I can email you about it, but I hate to cut this off as people's minds are churning.
Email me.
I guess the 13th is the Monday.
The 13th is possible.
Okay, I will
Email me, and we'll quick people's thoughts or questions. It would be better if we that was a discussion rather than a long presentation, and people could talk, and I could be part of, like the expert part of the discussion. This is a long one, but I might just do a brief introduction and throw it to the floor.
That would be great.
I could even look at some of the legal cases that have come up, the Arbery case and the Rittenhouse, and maybe even start with some of those things.
And I saw that you had an article in Daily Kos about today about the Arbery case and other cases. If people want to look for that. Okay, I am very sorry to interrupt this discussion, and I hope that it's okay with people to think about coming back in 2 weeks. I'll let you know. And this has been very important, and it's something we all need to know. And I thank you, Alan.
No, thank you. I'm very glad I got a chance to do this. I'm going to leave and go eat. And again, it was nice to meet people. If you email me, I will also put you on my updates list. And I'll put my email in the chat now, so everybody has it.
And I will, the one that you just gave at Hofstra.
Yeah.
Which I want to, CATAJS. I will,
Edu. That's, and I just sent that out to everybody. If you
Okay.
email me, I'll put you on my updates list.
okay, I'll put that also into when I send out the recording so people can respond.
All right, good night, everyone. I'm going to leave.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.